for a triplex. However, a lot of times we find that the properties are grandfathered in. So this one had been a triplex for some time, and it was what's called a legally non-conforming use of the property. I think, so then from that point, we just basically will schedule an appointment. We go out to the property. Now, our site visits are different now, obviously, with COVID than what they were before. So I'll walk you through what it looked like pre-COVID. So pre-COVID, we would go to the property and physically go into each unit. In this particular case, we would go into every room. We take photos of everything. We take a lot of notes. We actually spend a lot of time in basements, which surprises a lot of applicants when we're there, because a major contributing factor to the value of a property is in the mechanicals. So, you know, what type of furnace does it have? And, you know, does it have up-to-date electrical and plumbing? So we spend a lot of time doing that. We also do a contact interview. So pre-COVID, that was usually done during the inspection. So I would ask questions like, what type of well do you have? Where is your well located? Has the well been tested? We ask about the septic system. So there's a bunch of things that we'll ask about. We also ask a lot about ages of different elements. So the roof is a key one. We ask about the age of the furnace. Windows is another one that can be a little bit difficult for us to determine without asking. Now, since COVID, we're not doing interior site visits. So what we're having to do is rely upon our contact to provide us photos of the interior of the home and answer some questions. And all we do is our exterior portion of the visit, which is taking exterior photos and measuring the home. Now, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about how to measure it. Did you want to talk about that now?
Yes, yeah, that's a good point. So on a single-story home, we're going to measure the perimeter of the house and we're going to calculate the square footage. I prefer to say estimate the square footage so that consumers aren't expecting us to get it accurate like a surveyor or an architect would. When a house is 2 stories, then you would take the ground floor and multiply it by 2. And that would get you your total above grade square footage. In the case of this house, you'll see that part of it's 1 story and part of it is 2 story, but the 2 story portion is actually a half story because you'll see where the windows are cut by the eaves. So if you were going to draw from corner to corner on the eaves, you would see it makes a triangle instead of a square. Is that making sense to everybody?
So basically, if the windows themselves,
yes, thank you.
If the top of the window is above the bottom of the eaves, it's not a full 2nd story.
Yes. So based on where that line cuts the windows, we would say it's a half story or a 1/4 story or a 3/4 story, and that impacts the estimate of square footage. Again, estimates, it's not exact. You'll also notice this house has a little dormer on the side, which increases the square footage. We don't attempt to convince people that our square footage is 100% accurate. It's an estimate. So we're not going to say it's a full 2 story on the part. Another area with the square footage is people know that a finished basement adds value, but we don't include it in the square footage. It is included in the appraisal. It's just not included in that line of the report where it says what the above grade square footage is.
Alex, I saw that there was a note on there asking for us to repeat something. Did you have a question?
Yeah, can you just repeat that thing about the eave and the window? Like,
okay, so when you look at the windows, you can see on this property that the windows are within the triangle, within the gable of the eaves. So if you look at the bottom where the eaves trough would be on the house, on the sides, if the window is fully below that, it would be considered a full 2 story. But if the window is above it or cut in half by it, for example, then we look at it either being a 1/4 story, half story, or 3/4, depending on how much space you have. Because on the interior, you're going to have knee walls. Does that make more sense?
Do you mean that the windows should be below the peaks, the 2 peaks?
Not the peaks, where the eaves troughs go on the side of the house.
If you see the line that Diane is making with her mouse?
Yes.
Yeah, if the windows were below that, that would be a full story of living space.
Gotcha.
And above that, it's a partial story of living space.
One way to think about it too is is why they do this. So they take a house like this one, and there would have been a really large attic space, and this allows them to get some living space out of that attic. So it's just giving you that little bit of extra.
It's a lower cost per square foot to create living space in a half story than it would be in a 2-story.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
When you were saying that you look at MLS to see or determine what the value is, how do you find that information?
We have access to a portal that will give us not just currently listed properties, but we can also look up anything that's been sold on MLS previously. So we just type in the address and it will pull up this particular property every time it's been listed on that particular board. So we do that because it gives us an idea ahead of time of what we're going to see when we get there.
Okay, thanks.
I have another question also, because you were talking about appraisals and that you need to know, like, I guess the purpose of the appraisal. Like, what makes the difference between, let's say, a mortgage, like, does it even matter if it's a first mortgage, second mortgage, and then you're saying, you know, if it's a divorce? Like, what is the significance between those for you guys, or for us even?
For a mortgage appraisal, it's important that we do the appraisal for a mortgage company. If we were going to do a mortgage appraisal for the person who was borrowing the money, it would be an opportunity for that applicant to coerce the appraiser or bully the appraiser into coming up with a number that suits them rather than an unbiased opinion. So a mortgage appraisal is only for the lender. And our company policy, to avoid being put in a position where we are coerced or bullied, is that we only do it for the lender. So even though the person borrowing the money always ends up paying the bill, it's important that they understand in our company that that report is going to be finished only for the lender, and only the lender has the opportunity to talk to the appraiser about the appraisal after the appraisal's finished. That solves any issues of anything unethical happening. Now for a divorce, now your question about the second mortgage. It is important that with the second mortgage, the lender and the appraiser are at a much higher risk of being held accountable to a higher standard because the amount of equity available is less. So if a mortgage went bad on a second mortgage, the lender has a lot bigger responsibility because they have to take over the payments of the first until they get this property sold. So on a first mortgage, there's a much bigger down payment, and the chance of a lender being in a position where they're financially injured is a lot less.
It's the same thing with divorce. It's about risk. The risk that we have and the level of service that we are required to provide. So with the divorce, they're only done by the CRAs. So we have 2 that are full CRAs within our company, Tracy being one of them. And part of the reason that we separate them is because there's a lot more time and detail put into those reports, mainly because you run a higher risk of ending up defending it in court.
And you know that there's going to be a lot more discussion after the fact. So there's going to be a lot more time just discussing the appraisal after it's done. So that's worked into the fee as well.
But one other thing to mention is that we quite often, when we go out to do inspections, we're told by a lot of contacts and applicants that we're a lot more thorough, that we ask a lot more questions. And I think you wanted to talk a little bit about why we're as thorough as we are.
The appraisers are governed by the Appraisal Institute of Canada, and they have a document called CUSPAP, which is the Canadian Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice. A lot of what we do is outlined in that document that plainly states that you shall measure every property. You shall measure every building on a property that has value. There are appraisers that rely on MPAC. MPAC is not unreliable for properties after 1970 or 1975. But before that, the measurements are estimated from the curb by people like appraisers. And I've seen impact be wrong by as much as 1,000 square feet on a house, especially when it was a bungalow and somebody decided to finish the second floor. They did it without a building permit, and next thing you know, MPAC doesn't even know about it.
And additions as well. People, they love to turn a porch into additional living space, and quite often MPAC doesn't know about it.
Yeah.
Did you want to move on into the report? Were there any questions about the prep and the inspection portion before we move on?
Yes. Can you just continue, because you guys were doing like really good about like telling us how you measure the outside and all that stuff. Can you just continue that process, and then we can move to the report?
How we do the measurements. So like Tracy was saying, we'll measure each wall. We actually draw it out as a sketch on just a basic piece of grid paper. Once we're finished the measurements, we have a tool that we can plot everything into, and it will give us the square footage.
I do have one pulled up if you'd like to see a sample of it. If you can
Yeah, sure. It can do that. I'll do it so that you can share your screen.
Is it only going to share the screen that I've got showing now?
No, click it. Oh, it says that we're disabled. We're not able to share our screen.
Okay. How do I go back to that other screen? Okay.
She has to reshare her screen.
Oh, sorry about that.
That's okay. I think I gave you access now to share. Do you want to try to see do you see the share button?
You can pick what you want to share.
It should be at the bottom. Do you see it at the bottom or no?
Yeah, no, we're working on it.
Oh, okay.
An open now, it's gone.
Okay, we'll just open it again. Okay, so Tracy's just gonna find the file again because
Okay, no problem. Okay.
just go to sketch. I have it in the directory.
It's not letting me do anything.
Okay, well, I'm not sure that that's going to work out, but while she's talking about it, we can also calculate it mathematically. So one of the things that we do is we use all those crazy formulas that you learned when you were a kid about calculating the area of a triangle at times in circles. But you can see here we basically just plot everything in. This isn't obviously the same property that we were showing you, but once we plot it in, it will give us the square footage, and then quite often we'll cross-reference that with MPAC if we're not sure that we're correct. We also cross-reference quite often with MLS to see if we've got the same information that, say, the realtor has, because there are some realtors that will post that.
Is it showing the sketch or no?
No, I don't. It's not showing.
Okay, it's not working because it is showing on my screen, so I'm not able to figure
But
that
on
out.
this, so what happens is on the Zoom, you have to, if you go to the Zoom, it'll say at the bottom, share screen.
Just go back to the meeting.
Yeah, it's in the meeting that you have to allow.
And then
There it is.
and then, there you go.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Now everybody should be able to see. So you can see we just basically plotted in.
That's not this particular property. That's just one that I had showing.
Yep, perfect. We can see it.
Are there any other questions about the inspection? Or I'm sorry, I apologize, I slipped. It's called a site visit.
Yes.
They're wanting us to call it a site visit so there's no confusion between what we're doing and what a home inspector would do.
Mm-hmm. And so when you do your measurements, for example, are the measurements, these are done on the inside of the house, right? Like you're doing each room, or is this on the outside of the house?
Everything is done typically on the exterior. We do sometimes interior as well. But what we typically would use is a measuring wheel. So we just walk up the wall of each each side of the house, and that's where we get our measurements. Sometimes we're not able to do that. So a good example would be, say, a townhouse condo. Obviously, I can't measure the outside of it because I don't have access to all walls. So instead, we'll measure from the interior. But when we do that, because square footage measurements are typically taken from the outside, we actually estimate and add a tiny bit to compensate for the width of the walls.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
Anyone?
sometimes in really bad weather, or if it's a property that backs onto a ravine and you physically can't walk behind it, we'll use inside measurements quite often in the basement where there's less walls.
And for that, we typically would use a laser measuring tool.
Okay, makes sense. Anyone else have any questions?
Yes. Can maybe I just forgot, but can you remind me how you determine the square footage of the half level, or it's not taken into consideration?
No, we estimate
It is.
it.
Okay.
So what we would do is we were talking about where the windows are in relation to the eaves. If
Yes.
it cuts the window in half, we would call it a half story. And then if it cuts in the upper quarter of the window, we would call it a 3/4 story. And if it cuts
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so
That's
how
easy.
So if the main floor was 1,000 square feet and we decided it was a half story, the second floor would be 500 square feet for a total of 50.
Yeah. That sounds easy to understand. Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions from anyone else? Okay, I
When
think
you're
we're
looking at your properties, you can usually get a reasonable value per square foot, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily do in residential. And it makes it easier to compare things if you can break things down to a unit of comparison. And price per square foot or sale price per square foot is one of the methods that you can use to get a quick check.
okay. That's good to know. Should I share my screen again, and we'll continue now with the appraisal? Okay. Okay. I think you need to stop sharing so that I can share.
Stop share.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. Okay, so should we start with the first page?
Yes.
Second page, actually? Second page? Or do you want to start with the first?
You don't need to start with that. You can go to the first real page.
So what you're scrolling through right now is just a cover page, and our letter of transmittal is what we call it. It basically just says what the purpose of the appraisal was, who it's for, but there's nothing in there that would be overly useful to you.
So this first section of the report typically is filled out, or maybe not filled out, but all the data is gathered before we even see the property. We can get the legal description from the, we call it the geo warehouse, and it's a printout that comes from the registry office. So at this point, we would know if the person that is the applicant owns the property or is buying the property. We would double check that the names that we're dealing with are the names on the application, so that we're not, so anybody involved knows that the person selling the property is allowed to sell that property. And if not, we make sure people are aware of that. So in the neighborhood section, we will use a combination of what we observe physically and what we gather from data from stats, again, from the geo warehouse and the MLS. We can ask it to print us out stats of what's the average sale price and what the average ages are in that neighborhood.
We also take a look at the market trends in that area. So we'll take a look at, in the general area, are the prices increasing, decreasing, are they stable? One of the things that we use to help determine that is we look at the supply on hand. So a metric that we use is the months of inventory. So it is with what is currently on the market, how many months do they anticipate it will take to sell that based on the trend? We also take a look at the sales volume, because that can be another good indicator of whether or not we're in a buyer's market or a seller's market. And especially with COVID, that can change very quickly. So we do pull it every single time we do it, just to make sure that if something's changed, we've accounted for it. Go on.
Well, this part's all the inspections, so you can take that.
Okay. All right. So basically what you're looking at here is taking all of the data that we gather when we're doing our site visits and our applicant or contact interviews, and just plotting it in. So it's taking a look at, you know, how old do we think the house is roughly, and taking a look at the type of, you know, roof and how many rooms are in there. So this is just a summary of what we see and what we've been able to research. One of the things that you'll notice is we assign an effective age of the property. And what that is it has nothing to do with the actual age. It is used more when we get into our cost approach, which I think Tracy's going to talk about in a little bit. But what it does is it allows us to determine how much the house has depreciated. You know, sort of like you buy a car, you drive it off the lot, and it's worth less immediately. We look at it the same way, but because with houses, you can revitalize them, you can do those renovations, you can actually reduce your effective age, which would then obviously increase the value of the property.
Like in this case, this house is well over 100 years, but effectively the market is thinking it's more like 40 years.
So you can continue scrolling down. We'll go on to the next page. The bottom section is just a narrative summary. So it's the same sort of thing, just a narrative summary. You will notice that I've clicked a box beside comments there that says detrimental conditions. That is something that we do to assist lenders to alert them to things that may be of concern. So later in the report, we'll actually see the detrimental conditions form, and we can talk more about what that's showing you.
One of the things that is interesting is in a subdivision, for example, there could be houses that have just sold. And the market is so finely tuned because they have so much data available to them that they might say that, you know, an extra deck is worth more money than a house without a deck. When it gets in reality of country properties, there could be 5 or 6 different things that the market isn't able to come up with a dollar amount for because there just isn't enough data. So even the buyers and the sellers, they look at it and say, well, I like that deck, but I don't know if that deck adds $1,000 or $4,000 or $8,000. Where in a subdivision, because builders break it down so fine-tuned that the market will also react that way. It doesn't work the same way in a unique property.
So then how do you guys take care of things like that when you know, like that, because from cities to going into the suburbs or even further, it's hard. How do you estimate those kind of things?
In that sales chart that you can see there, Veronica would have researched probably 3 or 4 different counties looking for duplex, triplex, fourplex properties. This is the most complicated property appraisal that we would generally come across is the one that we're using for an example, which is good. You know, it shows that it's not an exact science. So the idea being when you don't have truly similar sales, we want to find sales that are better or worse in all aspects for the subject. So we'll want to find ones that have a smaller lot and a bigger lot. Ones that have a smaller house and a bigger house, one that has a house that needs more work, a house that needs less work. And the more ways we can bracket the subject property with our data, even if our data isn't similar, if we can bracket it, then we know that it has to be between those 2 points, and we can narrow it down to the best of our ability, that if we're saying one is worth $50,000 more because it's bigger, and then we can find one that's smaller, then we can narrow down those adjustments. It isn't an exact science at all. By doing similar easy appraisals, as we call them, in town, it gives us the skill set that when we transition out to a property that there are no comparables, that we are able to pick the data that's available to us. We can't create data. We only have the data that's available. And based on that data of some being inferior and some being superior, we know what has to be between those 2 points.
And sometimes it won't be possible. So in this particular one, you'll see that the location of the subject is inferior, is not as good as compared to all 3 comparable properties that we're looking at. That is because there aren't a lot of triplexes in small rural areas. Yeah. So you'll have that, and we do our best to make an adjustment, but at the end of the day, what we're giving you is our educated opinion. You're not getting the perfect number. We can't predict the future. We just make a best guess estimate based on the knowledge that we have and the experience that we have, which is why we have people like Tracy, who've been in the business for a very, very long time, because her instincts will be a lot better than, say, someone like myself who's just started. So one of the things I was going to talk about later, but since I've gone down a tangent, there's also different levels for the appraisers. So right now I'm what's called a candidate, and Tracy is a CRA, which basically means it's almost like an apprenticeship. I complete the appraisal, but every single appraisal that I do, Tracy reviews entirely. And if she doesn't agree with me, we spend a lot of time hashing it out and talking things through to get it to the point where she's comfortable, and utilizing her experience to make sure that you get the best possible or most accurate possible outcome.
So in this sales chart here, you'll see there's a number of adjustments and large adjustments. If you were a lender and you're reading this report and you see this many and this large of adjustments, that should be your alert that this isn't a normal property and your risk is greater. If there is a town property in the subdivision, there might be the biggest adjustment being minus 10,000, and there might only be 3 or 4 adjustments total. And if you read an appraisal like that, then you would know that your exposure to risk is very small.
That's really good to know.
One of the other things that you can look at to help you determine whether or not, well, what your risk level is to take a look at the row that says adjustments. So you can actually see both a net and a gross adjustment percentage. So you can see for that first comparable that there was an adjustment of 140,000, but you can see that we adjusted 41% on the gross of the property, and once everything was done, we reduced it by 34%. That's quite high. What we like to see is nothing greater than 20%.
Yeah. The big lenders, the big banks, they have appraisal guidelines, and that is what they're taught when reviewing an appraisal, is to watch those numbers. If they're reviewing an appraisal and it's like 5% across the board, then they know that their exposure to risk is very limited and they can move on. But when they see numbers like this, that's their cue to read it carefully and ask the appraiser any questions. And sometimes they won't lend on a property if it has big numbers like that. That's where it's more specialized lenders that get involved.
Mm-hmm.
Could you scroll up one bit? There's something basic that we forget to explain to people. So you'll notice that the adjustments have minuses and pluses. The plus isn't printing, but it's a positive if there's no minus. What that is saying is that's the estimate the appraiser has given that shows the subject is equal to, superior to, or inferior to. So on the very first comparable, you'll see where it says the date, there's a plus 15. That is saying that the market has gone up approximately $15,000 since that property sold. So we're adding $15,000 to what the value of the subject would be. So we're starting with the sale price of the comparable, and then we're going to make estimates of differences. So that comparable sold for $411,000. If the only difference was the time, we would be saying the subject would be worth $411 plus 15. Then you go down the chart and you can see that we're saying that Tilsonburg is a minus 25. What that is saying is that if everything was the same except for location, a threeplex or a triplex in Tilsonburg would have sold for $25,000 more. The subject is $25,000 less. We take off 25. So we add 15 for the time, inflation, and then we took off 25 because it wasn't in town. Going down the, stay in the same chart there, Diana. Yeah, same column, yeah, there you go. And then we go down again where it says 2-story versus 1.5 stories. So that 2-story home was a brick, better quality construction. So we're saying that the subject is worth $20,000 less because it's inferior construction quality, being a 1.5 story with no brick.
And architecture as well,
Yeah.
is another major one that we look at.
So when we do all those pluses and minuses in each column, we're applying that to the sale price of that comparable. So that for that property that's sold for $411,000, we add and subtract all the differences that we've estimated, and down at the bottom we come up with that comparable is saying the subject is worth $271,000.
And so we'll do that for each comparable, and then our goal is to keep the range between them within 5%. So if our range is within 5%, we know that we're being fairly accurate. If our range is outside of 5%, and it will happen sometimes with difficult appraisals, yeah. But it does speak to the accuracy.
Yeah.
Ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, we can scroll down now, Diana.
Unless you have questions.
Anyone have any questions? No, I think
where does it show the range?
The adjusted values on the bottom of the chart.
Okay.
That is saying that based on all our assessment, the subject is going to have a value between 255 and 284.
And then if you scroll to the bottom of that page, it will show you the estimate that we have made based on that information. And we actually will explain, if you were to read through all those comments, we'll explain why we chose where we did within the range. So if I have a range of 255 to 284, but you can see that the one that was 255 has the lowest net adjustment percentage, that indicates to me that it's likely most similar to the subject, and I would rely on it more heavily than I would say the one that came in at 284 that had over a 30% net adjustment.
Every time we make an adjustment, our propensity for being inaccurate is higher. The fewer the adjustments we have to make, the better chance you have of not being incorrect.
And so, like, let's say this one in St. Thomas, that you're saying it's more accurate. So how do you deal with, because these ones are in Tilsonburg, when do you decide that you're going out of the area to staying in the area? Or I'm not sure.
So we try our best to pull from the same neighborhood. So when we're doing a subdivision, I may be able to pull 3 houses from the same street that are the exact same house. But when I'm doing something that's rural, I start nearby and I expand, and I keep expanding until I get enough data that I can come up with a number. So in this case, we had to expand further than we normally would like to, and we take that into consideration. But the difference between Delmer and Tilsonburg versus Delmer and St. Thomas is actually more similar. It's a less preferred area to live in comparison to Tilsonburg.
Yeah. And the amount of rent that you would get, because this is an income property, so that's one of the criteria, the rents in St. Thomas are probably similar to what you would get for rent in Delmer. Whereas rent in Tilsonburg, people might pay more per month to live in Tilsonburg than they would in Delmer. It gets complicated because we need to understand the markets in a lot of different villages and a lot of different cities.
Mm-hmm.
We also have to put ourselves in the mindset of the person who would be buying the property. So the way that I adjust and the way that I think when I'm doing the report is going to be very different when I'm doing an income property versus doing a residential property for, a homeowner. So a homeowner is going to care a lot about the aesthetics, is going to care a lot about, you know, the comfort and the landscaping and so on. And maybe with the income property, I mean, you're really just looking at how much money am I going to make off of this? So if I have that in my head, that's the way that I think when I'm doing this appraisal. But when I'm doing other ones, I can be swayed a little bit more by pretty.
That's right. And also on an income property, you'll notice the last two lines on the chart talk about gross income and a GIM. GIM is short for gross income multiplier, which I'm sure you use all the time when you're deciding what you want to invest. This is the most simplest method of taking the sale price and the gross income and coming up with a multiplier. And we also use those in estimating the market value of another income property. You would not see that on a single family home. Even if you were buying a single family home as an income property,
the market in general doesn't think about it the same way.
that's right.
And so what you were talking about specifically about, for example, someone who's going to buy a house and live in it to someone who's using it as an income property, do those, I guess those kind of things also will affect the price of the property?
Yes, for sure. So this particular property, you're going to be willing to spend a lot more on it as an investor because there's good potential for rent. However, based on condition, you may not want to actually live there. So that's one of the main things that we look at. It's where an investor is more forgiving in some areas and maybe more picky in other areas.
So we need to come up with the highest and best use of who's the most likely buyer of a property. So even though an investor may buy a single family home in a town, they are competing with first-time home buyers who may be willing to pay more than what an investor is going to pay. Whereas a triplex, the chance of a first-time home buyer willing to buy that property is limited. Even if they are willing, they probably don't have the ability to get it financed. So the income property buyer does not have a lot of competition from single-family home buyers.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that makes sense. Anyone have any questions?
Yes, I do. So back to the 3 homes on the same street. If they all sold for different prices, but all other things identical, do you average out the price?
If that happened exactly as you said, I would.
Yes.
But I mean, typically we'll find something that's different. So if I have 3 houses that are the same and 2 have a deck and 1 doesn't, and our subject has a deck, I'm going to rely more heavily on the ones that have the deck versus the one that doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
Or if one sold 4 months ago and was a little bit less money, then that would be because of time. So the market's going up a little bit, and so we make a time adjustment.
We actually really like when that happens because it gives us the ability to see what the adjustment should be. So if I look at 2 houses that are literally identical, but one has a deck and one does not, and the difference in price was $5,000, I now know that the market will pay approximately $5,000 for a deck that looks like that one. So the next time I'm doing a more difficult property, I can think about that and know that, you know, $5,000 is a good benchmark, is a good starting point for what a deck might be worth.
On that style
of property.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of things that go into it, but it helps.
So you would average out the price? It actually is happening to me. There are 3 other homes that are pretty much identical from what I'm aware of.
Yeah.
But they all sold for different prices. The most recent one sold for a lot.
It's fine. It's an inflation adjustment for sure. It's warranted.
So then they wouldn't average it in theory. If it was identical but one is more recent, they would rely on the more recent one.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we can move on to the next page.
So this section here is just taking a look at the history. So we would list previous sales of the property. We also take a look if there's been a listing within the last year and if there are any pending sales. So in this particular case, you can see that we talk about the fact that the property is being sold privately. One of the things that we look at specifically with private sales is whether or not the sale is arm's length. And what that means is, does the buyer and seller know each other? Is it possible that the price that they're paying is impacted by not having been on the market? So in general, if you put something on the market, you advertise it, you're going to potentially get a higher price than if you were selling it privately. But you know, it depends. It depends, but that's something that we're cautious of. So when we're doing a property that was listed on MLS, sold after 30 days, you know, realtors were involved, it's a really good indicator of what the market's willing to pay because it has been put on the market and that is what the market is saying that they will pay. But when it's private, we can't rely heavily on the actual sale price because we don't know what would have happened had it been marketed.
Yeah. We don't know if the buyer was well informed and experienced, or if the buyer was sold a big story that's not true. Mm-hmm. With a private sale, there's really no consumer protection against lies. Mm-hmm. So somebody can say that they have a perfectly good well, and in the real estate industry, they generally don't tell big whoppers of lies because the real estate agents don't want to have to put in a new well later. Yeah. So if they say it's a good well, then it's a good well.
On this page, we also take a look at exposure time. So it's if you were to invest in this property and your intention was, say, to flip it, how long would it take for you to sell that property? And we take a look at what's going on in the market at this time. One of the things you'll notice right now is with COVID, we can't be sure. We're making estimates, but we put right in the report that, you know, this could impact it, and there's no way for us to know with absolute certainty whether the market's going to continue as it has been increasing or whether it's going to hit a point where we start to decline.
And in our reality in this area, we definitely seen a drop in sales volume, but we did not see a drop in sales prices. And then in the past month, even the sales volume has rebounded, and we've actually had more units sell per month in June of this year than we had in June of last year. So all the losses we had in April and May in volume have now recovered. Mm-hmm. But that could change next month depending on what the government says. Mm-hmm.
So we can continue on. The section that we're kind of breezing over just explains the different approaches that we're going to use for the particular appraisal, but we're going to go and look at each page so we can kind of skim past that.
I'd like to stop right there.
Yeah, it's like you do see scope, which is important for us to talk about. Did you want to talk about that?
Sure. So all that fine print is, it is important, and it's in fine print just to make reports smaller so that the banks can quickly glance over what they want to see. These reports are intended for people who have a lot of experience with appraisals. When you're a new lender, I would take the time to read all that fine print. They'll talk about the limitations of an appraiser. For example, if somebody gives us incorrect information and we rely on that information, there's an opportunity that the appraisal might not be accurate. So in the scope, we quickly jot down what was involved in our research. So the 8 points that are in fine print, that's what goes into every appraisal. And then we usually add one little sentence. This case says that we didn't do an interior site visit because of the COVID situation and where our data came from. But those 8 points in fine print, which I can't even read because I don't have my glasses on, that talks about what an appraiser is expected to do in their research.
We can scroll down now.
And again, all this fine print talks about the limiting conditions. So it is important that those are read and understood. I can't even Can't even see it.
Actually, when I was trying to like fix it and edit it, it kind of messed up your form. So it actually doesn't show properly the way you guys have it. 'Cause for some reason,
Okay.
I think we have different versions. It like the words are coming out of the
Yeah, oh, I
fonts
see.
and stuff. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened there.
So down at the bottom, you can see that there are 2 signatures on there. That is your indication that a candidate has likely done the appraisal. There is the odd chance that a CRA may have done part of it and had another CRA finish it. You may still see 2 signatures, but it's usually an indication that you've had a candidate. And then down on the next page, you'll see our extraordinary items. And this is anything that is above and beyond the standard limits that Tracy was mentioning but couldn't read.
Yeah.
So for example, right now, one of the things, if that first paragraph there is basically saying that we don't predict the future. We use past data and we use it to best extrapolate what would happen in present time. But if you buy the house and then want to sell it in 6 months, if the market has declined, we've said that we're not predicting the future and we're not liable for that. We talk about COVID and the different things that are impacted by that. So the fact that the market trends are more difficult to predict. We talk about the fact that we couldn't go in the property and had to rely on the contact for greater information than we normally would. There's also a section that's hypothetical conditions. So I'll give you a good example of that one. If you bought a property with the intent to change the use of it. So if you bought a property and it is presently a single family home and you want to convert it to a duplex, we would have to look into the zoning and whether or not it's possible. And if we determined that that was a highly likely outcome of the sale, then we could do the appraisal based on that, but would have to list it as a hypothetical condition. So we would say, we are basing this on the assumption that you will be able to get the zoning changed. So we can move on.
The cost approach, the other chart that we looked at was the direct sales comparison approach, and that's typically what the market relies on. As a check method, we do a cost approach. We try to find vacant lots and get a range of what the lot would sell for if there was no improvements on it whatsoever. On this particular property, we're estimating the land value or the lot value to be $100,000. We can use building manuals or construction contracts, and we have access to both, to estimate what it would cost to replace that house brand new. So in this case, we're saying that the house and the patio would come to approximately $465,000 to replace. And then that depreciation ties in with the effective age. There's 3 types of depreciation that affect a property. Physical is the one that we're most familiar with. If the roof is leaking, then we need a roof. And that cost of doing that would be physical. There's also functional, which means if the floor plan isn't quite right and it impacts how much rent you can get for it, then that's functional depreciation. And then there's locational. People will pay more to live in Tillsonburg than they will in Delmar, so that could be locational depreciation. There is a way that we can get that 65 number from the market. It's complicated. I'll run through it quickly, and it's really hard for people to understand, so I apologize if it doesn't make sense. If we take a property that's sold for $400,000 and we know the land is worth approximately $100,000, then we know the contributory value of the building is $300,000. If we know that that building costs $400,000 to build, then $100,000 is the total depreciation. And we can turn that into a percentage. And if we do that enough times, we can come up with a range of depreciation based on location, condition, and function of a house. And that depreciation estimate given there is the total depreciation of all 3 types of depreciation. In this case, we estimated it to be 65%. So what that is saying is if somebody spent $300,000 on that,
Yeah, 300.
If they spent $300,000 on that house, it would look like brand new. But nobody has spent that much money, so today that house is contributing about $160,000, plus the $100,000 for the land, plus $20,000 for the well and the septic, comes up with a value estimate of $283,000 for that cost approach.
So we can keep going unless there's questions about cost approach.
Anyone have any questions? I think we're good, I guess.
The income approach is also a way that we take other sales, break them down into what their incomes were, and come up with a cap rate, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. You probably have more complicated models to work with than what we use. This is a simplified system. And after we've come up with the income and expenses for the subject, we compare it to the cap rates that we derive from analyzing other sales of income properties. And that cap rate comes from that analysis. We apply that cap rate to the net income of the subject, and that gives us a market value based on the income approach. So when we've had a value from the income approach, the cost approach, and the direct sales comparison approach, our final market value should be bracketed by those three approaches to value.
With the understanding that typically we put greater emphasis on our direct sales comparison approach. With an income property, we do rely a little bit more heavily on the income approach as well.
That's the Appraisal Institute is the one that says we should rely most heavily on the direct sales approach, even though the individual investor is, he's probably putting 90% of his weight on the income approach. The Appraisal Institute says for market value estimates that we should be basing it on sales of other properties.
One of the things with the income approach that can make it a little bit more difficult is we quite often don't have all of the information that we really would like to have. So for example, if the property you're buying is not fully rented at this time, we have to estimate the market rent in order to determine an estimate of the income. And same thing with the comparables that we're using to derive our cap rates. We're having to look at estimating the maintenance costs, because quite often they don't give us maintenance, for example. We do the best with the data that we have.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. I think so that's it for the three approaches. The only thing that we haven't touched on that you might be interested in is the detrimental conditions form, which should be at the end of the report, if this is my report.
At the very end?
It should be at the very end. That's where I usually put it. You can see we put in photos of everything, maps. So that's just supplementary information that you guys can take a look at. And that one's just our zoning map. And there we go. So there's our limited uses detrimental conditions. So basically, this is where I was talking before about anything that may impact a lender's willingness to lend on a property. So one of the common things we see are cracks in foundations. We see moisture or mold. And if you scroll down to the next page, it looks at a more locational detrimental condition. So we take a look at, is it in the floodplain? Is there debris? Is there a cemetery nearby or railroad tracks? So different things that would impact the marketability of the property in the future.
This particular form was requested by lenders to be added to the standard form put out by the Appraisal Institute. And it is intended for lenders to have a quick glance. Is there anything we need to be aware of?
Mm-hmm. I think that's about it.
Does anyone have any questions?
I think we've lost them all.
Oh no, they're there. But I do have a question. What about, for example, this is more a general question, between because I noticed that there's differences in appraisers. Well, you said some of them at the beginning, but also even some people do appraisals just for like A lenders and B lenders, or just don't do it for. So how does like is that because of different certifications, or is that just a company that does that, or?
Well, I'll give you probably a more blunt answer than Tracy would. It has to do with the level of service that you have to provide and how likely you are to have the applicant contact you and expect you to redo your work. So there's a lot of appraisers that work for A and B lenders because it's easier. It just
A
is.
lenders.
Well, A lenders, yeah. So it's just easier because the person looking at it doesn't have any sort of emotional attachment whatsoever to what's going on. So if it works or it doesn't work, it doesn't impact them as much. Whereas when we're working for, you know, a private lender that really wants this deal to go through, somebody who's investing and wants the report for those purposes, we have a greater risk. Because if we come up with a number they don't like, we're more likely to be sued. We also have a greater amount of work ahead of us because they're more likely to contact us if they don't like the number we come up with.
There's two different appraisal organizations as well, and the Appraisal Institute is the one with more education, and I'm not sure, but I think it's higher insurance.
Mm-hmm.
The other one, a lot of lenders, they don't want to have their hard work done by, I think it's called the Canadian National Association of Real Estate Appraisers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a lower level of expectations. Our company does do it all. We do the divorces, the estates, the B lending,
and we specialize also in rural properties. There's a lot of appraisers that are just, quite frankly, more comfortable in cities and in some of the towns, whereas a good chunk of our business, I would say probably at least 30 to 40% of our business is done in rural areas, you know, on well and septic.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And so does it, because I like with my appraisal, you know, I had it done with my broker and then privately. There was a difference in the price. What is it, just because privately, like you said, you have to go into so much more detail? Is that why you will see like big price differences, or?
So the AMCs, the appraisal management companies, they get a discount because of volume. Or, you know, say they might order 1,000 appraisals, whereas a mortgage broker might order 5.
Sorry, I actually meant appraisal of the houses. Like if you get your house appraised by 2 different companies, and there's a big difference, like what causes that big difference
That's
to happen?
Good question, because we've had lots of times where people will say, well, I had it appraised a year ago for 400,000, and they want us to explain why the value is different. I said, well, we can't do that because we didn't do the first appraisal. And that is where, like, every appraiser given a property and the same access to data is going to come up with 3 different numbers because it isn't an exact science. So even an appraiser using 3 of the same comparables might come up with a difference because we don't have enough data to pinpoint it down to the dollar amount.
Was that your question, or were you talking about the cost of the appraisal?
No, not cost. I wasn't talking about cost.
Okay,
Yeah.
just wanted to make sure we answered it.
Yeah. So does anyone else have any other questions? I think we have to like absorb all the information that you provided. I feel like I have to review all those documents.
I actually do have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
You said that it's different between an investor and a buyer just for themselves, right? What about, have you ever faced like one person who wants to move like in a triplex and then rented out the other 2 rooms? And what about when these kind of triplex are not legal plus comparing with a legal one? Does that affect somehow does affect the appraisal?
Yeah, so What happens in the industry is if you had a triplex and we find out that it's only a duplex, typically what the lender wants us to do is appraise it as if it's a duplex and call that third unit just for storage. That's what happens in lending. Now, if a consumer said, how much is this going to impact the value? That would be a more complicated appraisal because we're going to be held to an account of what they want to know what to pay for it. So in the lending part of it, they're saying, okay, we're only going to lend this person 80% of the value that the appraiser comes up with, and we're telling the appraiser to ignore that third unit. So the buyer is going to be expected to have a much higher down payment in order to make that work. If the buyer wanted to know, help me come up with a price to buy this unit when 1/3 of it is illegal, I'm going to rent it anyways, because in reality, that's what happens, right? Just because it's not legal doesn't mean they're not going to continue to do it. But the Appraisal Institute says that we are only allowed to put value on legal uses. So it gets much more complicated. So then we would say, okay, so we know what it would be worth if 2 units are legal. How much will the market pay for a third unit that's illegal? And we won't have good data for that.
One of the things we can look at is comparing it to granny suites, in-law suites.
Yeah.
So quite often if somebody's using, if I've got a duplex and there's a basement unit, for example, that's being used as a duplex, I will appraise it as basically a 2-family home, but not a duplex.
You're allowed to put your parents in it or your kids in it, but not charge them rent. You're allowed to have the second kitchen and the second bathroom, but you can't call it an income property.
So then we would do the appraisal without the income approach. We would be doing it as though a buyer was looking to purchase it for themselves and not for purposes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. Anyone else? We'll do one more question if anyone else has one more question. No?
Just clarification, sorry. So that means you would give the home more value if it had a granny suite, in-law suite, granny suite?
Yes, in general, if a property does have the ability to have, family live in a separate unit, it does add value. It doesn't typically add as much value as what you would see if it was a legal income property.
Gotcha, thank you.
Especially in the market now, there is a demand for that second living space in the typically single family homes that are now becoming 2-family homes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thank you so much. The information you provided was really good, a lot. I feel like we all need to absorb it and like let it sink in, because like that, even some people are asking to do a part 2 series. So maybe we can have you back on maybe in like in some time, in a month or so, and probably let us absorb the information, and then maybe we can do another chat. But so would you like to actually provide everyone your information?
Yeah, I was going to say that we can provide the email, and if anybody does have questions, they're more than welcome to send us a note, and we'll do our best to answer in a relatively timely fashion.
Mm-hmm.
Diana, did you just want to share the email address with them?
Sure. Yeah, it's the admin one, right?
Yeah, if you just want to share that with everybody, then they're more than welcome to contact us there. We also have our website, which is www.tricountyappraisal, no S on the end, .com. .ca. I lied. But don't put an S on the end of appraisals. It's
okay.
Appraisal.
Okay.
But thank you for having us. We really appreciate the interest and always love to take the opportunity to educate people.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think everyone got a lot of value out of it, and like that, I feel like we'll probably be doing a second series once we all let it sink in and we start now realizing like what we want to look for and what kind of next questions we would have.
Great. For sure.
Well, thank you so much. It was really nice having you guys, and thanks for everyone coming. And we'll definitely see everyone in the next meetup. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Good.
Bye.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, she's driving now.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.